Hi, this is Jillian York.
And this is Katherine Maher.
And this is Interrobang. And this week we've got a few different topics, including at the top of the list, Tuesday, February 11th is the day we fight back. And what are we fighting back against?
Well, there is a effort by a number of organizations and more than 4,000 websites to encourage people to call Congress about the NSA.
Right. So as you can see, Catherine and I are both pretty involved in this, and we should give you the heads up that our two organizations, EFF and Access, respectively, are deeply involved in this effort. So we're not in a position to argue too much about it, but we think it's really important that you guys know about it.
And then after that, we're going to go right from the day we fight back in NSA surveillance to Russia, to Sochi and the Winter Olympics there. We're going to talk a little bit about, what is it, Jillian? The media coverage, that is how the media has been covering themselves?
Yes, and Sochi problems, the lovely and entertaining hashtag that is riling up folks who think that there should be a bit deeper coverage on what's happening in Russia.
And then after that, I think we're going to flip back over to something that Jillian knows a lot about and has tried to walk me through in recent months.
So after that, we're going to talk a little bit about a bill that's being proposed. Where's my link? A bill that is being proposed in first the New York legislature, but now there's actually a bill in the House trying to push back against academic institutions that have fought in favor of boycotting Israel. And so there was first there's an initiative pending in the state Senate of New York, and now there's a bill. I think it's HR 4009. The Academic Freedom Act. And, the joke going around in some of my circles is whenever you hear freedom in a bill, duck. Because it doesn't mean freedom. On the other hand, though, we're actually in favor of another bill at the moment with freedom in the title. So I feel like, to be fair, we should put that joke aside. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at First Look Media.
That's right. I think one of the things that we were really interested to see with the launch of today's product, was it today? Maybe it was yesterday. I think it was today, which is the Intercept, the first of the digital magazines from First Look Media, is the striking inequality of the reporters and staff members on the Intercept's masthead. So interested in talking a little bit about that. But since it is a Monday evening and I think that it's kind of late here, why don't we just get started?
Sounds good. So getting started means talking about tomorrow, but by the time you guys hear this, we'll be talking about today. So that's going to be confusing for you. And that is the day we fight back. And so when you go to that website, I think it's thedaywefightback.org. Is that correct, Catherine?
That's right.
When you go to that website, if you are a U.S. citizen, and we encourage you to go there, if you're a U.S. citizen, what are you going to be supporting exactly?
Well, if you're a U.S. citizen and you go to the Day We Fight Back, starting at midnight tonight Eastern Standard Time, it's going to switch over from being a website that provides information about about NSA surveillance to being a website that'll direct you straight to your legislator. So it'll instruct you and give you very easy steps by which you can actually call first your senator and then your two congressional representatives and tell them that you are in support of the USA Freedom Act, which is a piece of legislation that is pending. It has not gone to the floor or gone to a vote or anything yet like this, but I think these organizations involved are trying to mobilize support for for the USA Freedom Act and actually move it to a vote in Congress.
Great. And if you are not in the U.S. and you're one of our listeners, the Day We Fight Back is also a global action. And so there's been this thing that we've talked about a little bit on previous episodes called shorthand called the Necessary and Proportionate Principles. The 13 Principles for the Application of Human Rights to Communication Surveillance. This is a joke in my office. I mean, nobody can ever remember the full thing. So, it's one of those things where activists love to give things accurate and lengthy titles. But this is a set of principles that seeks to apply human rights to surveillance everywhere, not just in the United States and not just looking at the NSA. And so we're hoping that our friends outside of the U.S. Will also join us and support us. And we've actually got a huge coalition going. And my goodness, if I can't find that link right now. But there's a huge coalition that is supporting these ideas outside of the U.S. and basically, not only fighting against NSA surveillance of citizens in other countries, but also looking at their own country's surveillance.
Yeah, that's right. I think last that I had looked, there are actions tomorrow in Brazil, Uganda,
Serbia,
the
Croatia,
UK, Canada,
Brazil. Yeah, we already said
Fr-
Poland,
France,
Germany.
Germany, the Philippines. It's really going to be quite a remarkable day of action against mass surveillance. And Jillian, it was interesting. I think we were both on in a discussion earlier today about why does this matter for non-U.S. citizens to
Yeah,
actually
yeah,
take this
yeah.
action?
Yeah, so Catherine and I were on this mailing list of friends that we have in the Middle East and North Africa that are all doing the same kind of work that we are. And somebody put forward the idea, like, okay, why should I support this? And I mean, this really happened. I'm not making this up. I could even probably pull up the email without identifying the person. And basically, the concern was just, okay, yeah, I'm annoyed with the NSA too, but like, why is this my fight? Shouldn't you guys be fighting this? Shouldn't this be an American fight?
Yeah, I think that was, and it's a really sort of legitimate point, right? I think that the biggest criticism that we've heard about some of these issues around reform is that in the United States of mass surveillance programs is that they don't really effectively address the fact that the actual primary targets of these surveillance programs are people who live outside of the United States, for whom privacy is just as fundamental and essential a right as people who live inside the United States. And so, Jillian, do you remember exactly how this discussion was resolved?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the other important point that the individual brought up was the idea that okay, so this might stop one kind of surveillance, but what about all of the other, military surveillance, economic surveillance, et cetera? And I mean, I thought it was a really good point. That's not necessarily the same as the NSA surveillance, and what kind of effect will this have on other types of surveillance? And I mean, it's a really good question that I actually didn't even have the answer for readily, but the point was that the NSA surveillance is unprecedented in its scope. And so we're looking at dragnet surveillance that covers Americans, non-Americans, folks all over the world, and that this should be something that we're all trying to stop because it definitely has a trickle effect. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Tunisia right now, with the new surveillance agency there, a lot of my friends there that have been criticizing it have been saying like, thanks, this is the NSA that allowed this to happen. And I don't know if that's a valid argument or not, but it's certainly it's certainly not a new argument. We've seen it before with censorship, we've seen it with net neutrality, and we're seeing it again.
Yeah, I think that one of the sort of really critical things is that the sort of norm. I hate to sound like a human rights person, but the fact that is that when a country like the United States, which tends to be rightly or wrongly, sees itself as a leader on these issues and
Right.
has this really sort of legitimizing power on the international stage, when a country like this does engages in mass surveillance of citizens around the world, its own citizens and citizens outside, it really legitimizes the actions everywhere of similar surveillance programs. And interestingly, I was talking about this with someone in the U.S. government recently who works on these issues and is while a representative of the government is also keen to sort of defend human rights. And the observation that they made is that while these programs are truly beyond the scope and scale of anything they would have expected and definitely are in need of reform, the one significant difference that exists between the United States and other countries with mass surveillance programs is that we do actually have these mechanisms of accountability, limited as though they may be, with regards to things like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, with regards to the intelligence and judiciary committees, which allow for us to engage our lawmakers in actually passing legislation around reform and allowing us to petition directly to the administration for increased transparency and accountability and to try to push that through as a matter of law as opposed to just presidential decree. And so while certainly I think they're far more limited than you or I would wish in terms of the checks and balances that they impose, they're far greater than that exists in other countries.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, yeah, I think really, so the response, which was your question before, what was the response to this? And the response to this was largely that this is, absolutely sorry about that noise. Absolutely a fight worth fighting, whether you're inside the U.S. or outside, because this does affect all of us. And in a society where a lot of these surveillance mechanisms are increasingly interlinked, from intelligence sharing between the U.S. and the Five Eyes countries, or frankly intelligence sharing that's starting to emerge between the U.S. and countries outside of that network. I think that's really what we're getting at.
So I mean, on the surveillance issue, I think as Jillian said, tomorrow is the day we fight back, and there are all these other organizations that are engaged. I think it's worth pointing out, and Jill, I don't know if you've heard this yet, is that it's actually not just the traditional activist organizations that are involved.
Right. Absolutely.
So, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the front page, like we have, you've got your Human Rights Watch and your Amnesty International, and that's not going to surprise anyone. You also have ThoughtWorks, which is a technology company, and the Libertarian Party, and O'Reilly Media, and the Free Software Foundation. Okay, that's not surprising. Tumblr, Mozilla, and the list goes on. What's the one?
Yeah, the one that I'm most struck by is the Reform Government Surveillance Group. So the Reform It's listed up there as a rather innocuous sounding name, but the Reform Government Surveillance Group is actually 7 of the largest internet companies out there. So it's AOL, it's Facebook, it's Google, it's LinkedIn, Microsoft, Twitter, and Yahoo. So these are not just, the sort of traditional run-of-the-mill, like celebrities and privacy organizations. Not that I think any of our work is run-of-the-mill, but I think it really speaks to the fact that these are issues that large companies think are actually incredibly important for their ability to function and to continue to develop and deliver their services to their users.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, is there anything else you want to add about that? I mean, it's going to come up tomorrow, or by the time you guys are... God, it's so weird to talk like as if you're recording on the same day. It's going to come up tomorrow or today if you're listening along at the moment. And is there anything else, any like final, urgings that you would have for our listeners?
Well, I mean, I would just definitely say go visit thedaywefightback.org and absolutely, take an action if you're inclined to take an action. If you're outside the U.S., sign your name, and if, find an action that's happening in your country. And if you're inside the U.S., call your senators and let them know what you think about these issues. As a segue, Jill, and I've been really hoping to make this segue, it's not just surveillance in the United States that's made the news lately. I don't know if you caught the news about bathroom surveillance in Sochi.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, okay, actually, I think that's the perfect segue into what we're about to talk about, because that story got buried. So there was this story, and I'm going to just pull it up while we're talking. I think it was in Gawker.
It was in Gawker, yeah.
Yeah, Gawker, Sochi, let's see, surveillance. Let's see if I can bring it up.
Russia says its Sochi bathroom spy cameras show no plumbing problems.
Yeah. So this is great, because here's how I envision it, and I know this is going to get a little stereotypical. I just imagine this deputy prime minister responsible for the Olympic preparations, Dmitry Kozak. He was, remarking on the same thing that we're about to talk about, the Sochi problems, not the hashtag itself, but just the complaints coming out of some of the journalists' hotel rooms and kind of making a splash. Because, these journalists are tweeting and then it's getting, I don't want to say retweeted, echoed by the media. And so this one guy, the deputy prime minister responsible, believes that these Western visitors are deliberately trying to sabotage Sochi's big debut, and says, "We have surveillance video from the hotels that shows that people turn on the shower, direct the nozzle at the wall, and then leave the room for the whole day." So what you're saying is you have surveillance video that shows inside the showers? And somehow that story has gotten buried underneath the complaints about the water and the lack of coat racks and the breaking curtains and the flimsy beds. And that is really one of the scariest stories, because, I have to say, this is my one criticism that I will make of some of my honestly, my heroes this past year and my allies. And I am talking about, a lot of the folks who've done some of the best work on covering NSA surveillance, is that Russian surveillance has been a huge blind spot. And, I've even heard things like, bringing up Russian surveillance is the new bringing up Saddam Hussein also tortures. And
what's that? I missed that.
I think that was actually a Glenn Greenwald tweet where, the comparison being made was that, raising Russia also surveils, as an argument, kind of whataboutism, as I think what this is called, is like the new Saddam Hussein also tortures, therefore it's fine that the U.S. tortures, which is no, neither one is fine, ever. in both cases. And so, I do understand that that's some of what's going on when people defend NSA surveillance. The folks that are defending it are saying, but all societies do this. And I understand where that is wrong. But at the same time, we shouldn't be just ignoring Russian surveillance because it doesn't happen on the same scale necessarily as NSA dragnet surveillance.
Right. Well, it's funny you say that. I think back in June of 2013, so last year, just over 8 months ago, we actually released a report on Russian-made surveillance tools and their use in the former Commonwealth states. And I have to tell you, it's a great report. It's really worth reading. It talks all about sort of the various different tools that are used and, how they were developed under the former USSR and how they've been sort of extended and sort of distributed today. And it sank like a stone. It's just not sexy, unfortunately. I don't know what it is about that part of the world that makes it extremely difficult, whether it's sort of a built-in cynicism or an expectation or a desensitization after years and years of pervasive state surveillance, ever since the end of the Second World War. But I tend to agree that, there is an assumption that that state surveillance is widespread and is sort of impervious to any rollback.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, this is a great piece, and I actually had missed it as well. And, I think, honestly, I would like for us to be doing more about Russian surveillance, too, and I think that part of the reason that we're not is that it is much more difficult to get information on. And so a lot of this stuff does require the kind of investigative journalism that we might not have the capacity to do. And so I hear that. And, it is something where, like I said, where it's not, I can't just blame the journalists because the information isn't as readily available. And so, of course, we're focused on the NSA's surveillance. But I find those comments to be kind of dangerous. And so coming back to Sochi problems, this is actually, like you said, this is a perfect example where this story really got buried underneath the now famous picture of the orange water referred to as peach juice coming directly from the tap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to On the Media today, which is a NPR show, and it was explicitly interviewing a spokesperson from the Committee to Protect Journalists, which talked about the fact that this should be an opportunity for Western journalists to be coming into Russia and be writing these stories. But instead, it's been so overwhelmed by this whole idea that by all these images and stories about how absolutely inadequately prepared Russia was, as you said, the peach juice. So tell me a little bit about what you saw when you first saw those tweets.
So here's where I'm probably going to argue against, I think here's where we're probably going to disagree. So, as a person that tweets a lot, I often arrive at a place and my expectations are not met, and my instinct is to complain about it on Twitter. And I think that this is true of a lot of folks these days, especially journalists who, deal with a lot of crap. And so what I saw was a bunch of journalists just kind of complaining on Twitter. There was this article in Policy Mike today, which we'll link for the listeners, that kind of says, oh, well, these are cultural misunderstandings born out of sheltered ignorance, and these posts actually reflect issues that directly impact the quality of life of Russia's 143 million people. And that's the thing, is that for me, even though I perceive these as just journalists complaining, I also saw what was behind them. And so when you look at these pictures of dirty water, Putin has famously said that he also has dirty water running from his sink. And, I'm not saying most people should be or are, well, maybe they should be, but most people are aware of Russia's issues around access to drinking water. But just to put that out there, I think the statistic is that only about 50% of Russians have access to, clean drinking water. And that statistic's a little bit old, but half of Russians. And so I guess what I saw from it is that these, pithy tweets do actually raise awareness of issues, and that it's not the journalists tweeting from Sochi who are responsible for taking that, but it's the media that's been covering those journalists' tweets that should be instead deducing the real problems and doing their job as journalists rather than just rounding up tweets from journalists complaining. So I guess I'm just I'm not inclined to blame the journalists tweeting from Sochi, most of whom are more sports journalists than they are investigative journalists.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't think that you're wrong in saying that. And I appreciate the perspective because I have to say, I saw those tweets coming in and I was sitting in an Airbnb apartment in New York City in the West Village, right? So a fairly nice part of town. And I just climbed up 6 flights of stairs and there were not even any sockets for me to plug my phone into charge.
Did you tweet about it?
I tweeted about the fact that, here we are complaining and saying like Russia's what a backwards place Sochi is. And I'm looking around this Airbnb, 6th floor walk up in Manhattan going, uh-huh. Right. Now, of course, as somebody who used to live in a 5th floor walk up with a shower in the middle of her kitchen, perhaps I'm a little less sympathetic that your shower curtain doesn't work in your hotel in Russia. But I guess my other reaction to that was, I've spent a lot of time traveling as well in many different places, in places that are, have severe structural deficits. So I think probably the most noteworthy of those is having spent some time in Juba in southern Sudan, where there were only 3 paved roads that ran through the entire country at the time when I was there. And my reaction to these tweets was like, was really sort of a first world problems reaction, a Sochi problems reaction, which is to say, yes, these are important issues. And I suppose that the underlying issue that they raised, which is the fact that Russia had made a commitment to be ready for these games and is not, in fact, ready for these games for any variety of reasons, actually masks exactly as you say, the underlying issues, which are looking at the fact that, people who labored on the construction of the various facilities have not necessarily been paid, the sort of overall sort of systemic infrastructure issues that you raised around clean drinking water, some of the other, the human rights violations that have been, very publicly sort of investigated with regards to people, gay and lesbian and the queer community. But I think that, part of the problem with that narrative and part of the problem with the way that this was represented was that these journalists who were tweeting, and obviously as an individual, they couldn't be aware of the fact that every other journalist around them was tweeting similar observations. But taken together, it struck me as a sort of form of I saw a commentator refer to it as Europhobia, which I thought was...
Euro what?
Europhobia.
Ah,
which I thought was really interesting because I did think that it spoke to sort of an expectation among the Western media elite that Russia is a backwards place and that this confirmed all of their most negative of suspicions, as opposed to, I think that you've seen similar problems with perhaps, running water issues or incomplete construction issues in a sort of middle income country. Those excuse me. I have a little cough. I'm trying to get over a cold.
Yeah, no, me too. I've been suppressing it.
I know, me too. You might have seen a very different response. So I remember that I think India played host to the World Cricket Cup about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a massive source of embarrassment for the Indian government that they were unable to construct and finalize the athletes' housings, and it was in really sort of terrible shape. If you saw the images, far, far, far worse than Sochi. But the reflection was not necessarily on, look at India, how backwards it was. It was a sort of an immediate response that turned to sort of where's the graft, where's the corruption, how has this been allowed to have happened in this country that, should have better checks and balances. And so I felt as though, yes, it's understandable that that individual journalists would respond like that, but in doing so, they're almost giving Russia a pass for just being Russia, as opposed to, having expectations for what this country's commitments are as a member of the both international community, but certainly as a member of this particular governing body that runs the Olympics.
I actually see it the other way around. I mean, I see what you just said. I thought your conclusion would be different, right? So like, no, seriously. So it sounds to me like what you just described about India is that people were not giving India a pass, but rather looking at India and maybe almost having lowered expectations for India than they do for Russia. I mean, it sounds to me like some of this might also be, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It sounds like some of this might be the expectation that Russia, with its proximity to Europe, should have its shit together, whereas nobody really expects India to have its shit together. That's what that sounds like.
Oh, but that sounds to me like the lower, what is it, the soft bigotry of lowered expectations?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, perhaps that is what it is. I suppose what I felt is just that there is sort of there's a strain within sort of the Western community of a distrust and an othering of Russia, and I felt as though that really came out in a lot of the narratives here
Mm.
around sort of we should have never trusted the Russians, and we should have always expected this was going to happen, and how silly we were to have let them pull the wool over our eyes of those Russians. So while Jillian was gone taking care of her cell phone, one of the things that I was looking at was an article she'd sent to me on Policy Mike talking about how these Sochi problems are really sort of representative of the fact that it's actually kind of more embarrassing for the United States than it is for Russia, because Russians themselves are quite used to these problems. But the thing that I really took away from this was the fact that in some ways the reporters themselves are coming from a position of tremendous privilege to be able to make fun of these issues. I think it touches a little bit on what we were saying earlier about how they're reflective of the systemic problems, but sort of more importantly to the point that Russians themselves might not sort of feel as empowered to be able to make these same criticisms that those in the West feel as though they're incredibly empowered to make.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that that's really true. And I mean, so I think that, my hope is that if I'm giving the journalists the benefit of the doubt, that they are going to come back from their trip and really cover these issues. And we don't know if that's the case. I mean, I've been looking at, for example, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, which has really, I mean, it has a really crappy history of engaging with political issues in general. They angered people a couple of years ago when they refused to recognize the Munich massacre of Israelis that happened at the Munich Olympics, and they refused to do a moment of silence, even at the request of some of the family members of those Olympians. And this is yet another case of the IOC refusing to engage. And there were some LGBT protesters arrested on Friday in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but their protests were linked to the Olympics. And the IOC basically said, as in many countries in the world, like Russia, you need permission before staging a protest. They're just very tone deaf in their response. And, I got in a discussion with this with a friend a couple days ago, and I kind of pushed back and said, well, yeah, but maybe the Western journalists are scared too. And I'm also, then I almost wanted to hit myself, like, so what, take the risk. You're not going to be disappeared like a Russian journalist might be.
Yeah. That's actually one of the things that was raised on the segment I was listening to on the media today, which was speaking with somebody from NBC, their sort of lead foreign correspondent. I think Peter Engel was his name, and he was sort of making a similar point, which is that this is an opportunity for journalists, Western journalists in particular, to raise some of the issues that at the moment Russian journalists are prevented from raising. They spoke with a reporter from the Committee to Protect Journalists, who said that it doesn't matter if it's raining in Sochi. As far as Moscow is concerned, the next couple days of weather forecast will only be sunshine, which I think speaks really clearly to the state of press freedom in Russia. But I know that, Jillian, you have limited time tonight, so rather than jump from there into Turkey, which is sort of where I want to go, all of a sudden, why don't we go a little further south?
Why don't we actually, I was thinking we could actually just jump right ahead to talk about the launch of First Look Media and table our other topic for next week, where I'm sure there will be a little bit more interesting news on that subject.
Sure. So, First Look Media launched today, the long-awaited. What do you know about it?
This is great. I actually, one of my former coworkers has left EFF to work with First Look Media on The Intercept, and he's there on that staff page, and so we're all very proud of him. That's Micah Lee. I know quite a few of the other faces on there too, and a lot of them are some of the best journalists out there that I really respect. But as Katherine pointed out to me shortly before we started this, one of the things that's incredibly noticeable on the staff page is that it is mostly made up of white men.
I hate it when that happens.
It happens so much.
The pale male stale.
Pale male fail. The pale male fail. Yes, exactly. So looking at this, I mean, you've got three amazing women, first off. Let's just put that right out there. 3 out of the 12 staff members on this page are incredible women that I really admire and look up to. That's Laura Poitras, Marcy Wheeler, and Liliana Segura. Then the men on there are, I'm a fan of the vast majority of them, actually. And so, I don't think that they're necessarily going after the wrong people, but I think that they've come up short on their own promises.
So what are those promises? I think that's interesting, right? I think one of the things that we sort of expect very frequently in the media is that there is going to be a preponderance of male voices. But First Look Media promised to be different, didn't they?
Yeah, so there was an article on Medium that pointed back to a tweet from Glenn Greenwald in November, where he said that they would be aggressively diverse, and that Laura and Liliana, two of the women that are in fact working on the project, were building it from the start, and there would be many more. I assume he meant women to come. And so, I mean, it's true that the organization has not stopped growing, and that The Intercept seems to be perhaps a segment of it, and not the entire company. But at the same time, aggressively diverse is not having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 white men and 4 people who are not white men. That's not aggressively diverse.
I actually take issue with Greenwald's tweet in the very way it's framed. The fact that Laura and Liliana are responsible for building in diversity ghettoizes the entire idea of diversity, doesn't it?
I can't disagree with you on that. And I mean, again, I feel like I have to say I'm a huge fan of Glenn, but I think that this is not so much a Glenn problem. This is really what happens when a group of white men try to build an organization and they have these blind spots where their version of aggressively diverse does not match my version of aggressively diverse, for sure.
Well, I mean, it's hard to blame them, right? This is an issue of national security, and what they're writing about is really technology focused. How many really qualified female voices are there out on these issues?
I'm going to go ahead and say quite a few. I mean, sorry, but this is what we do every day. And I mean, I work with one of the most, two of the most perhaps aggressively awesome voices out there on this topic. And not that I want them to be recruited away from EFF. I don't get me wrong.
It's okay, Jillian. I was just trolling you.
I thought so. But, I mean, there are so many incredible women that are out there fighting against surveillance, and a lot of them are reporting, and a lot of them are looking at this from technical means, and a lot of them are looking at it from a legal perspective. And so, Glenn comes from a legal and not a technical background. There are plenty of, even if we, clearly recognize the fact that there are fewer women than men in the technology field, and perhaps looking at this from that perspective, a lot of the folks on this page are not technologists.
No, most of them aren't. Most of them are journalists who sort of specialize in good old-fashioned shoe leather reporting and being wickedly smart and aggressive. I mean, I'm with you. I think that the sort of structural problems are embedded in First Look's launch, and to me, this is a sort of really disappointing failure. To be honest, I know that this is just the first of the many products that they plan to launch, but what we're looking at is 3 out of 12 total staff that are female, with very little indication of sort of what is to come, and on a really critical issue that I think that the founders of First Look would consider a defining issue of our time, and we're not seeing fair or equal representation of voices that are so important on these issues. And we're seeing quite a lot, in fact, I would argue, of conventional wisdom, right? So while there's been certainly a wide variety and range of opinions on the issues of the Edward Snowden leaks and on NSA surveillance, what we're actually seeing is a lot of the voices who are really sort of known quantities, and we're not seeing anything that maybe brings a slightly different perspective.
No, absolutely. And I just kind of clicked away from the Intercept and looked toward the First Look page about, the About page. It says a publication of First Look Media, and then it lists the publisher and the executive editors and the engagement editor and the site design development, all men. As far as I know, there are a couple names that I'm not sure about gender-wise, but looks like all men. More men.
Yeah. More men.
So yeah, I mean, I guess, I'm just disappointed. I think that this is going to be an amazing publication, don't get me wrong, and I'm really, really impressed with the direction that it's going in terms of the content. I read, I've looked at the welcome, and I've kind of I've also looked briefly at the first piece published by Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald, and that's exactly the incredible piece that I would expect from them. But at the same time,
what was that first piece about?
Oh, it's the NSA's secret role in the U.S. assassination program.
What is that assassination program? Because that sounds quite scandalous.
Oh, okay. Oh goodness, you want me to summarize an article that I skimmed,
No,
Catherine?
it's quite all
I
right.
feel like I'm
I
being.
just no, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to test you. I just wanted to make it clear that that was about sort of drones and the use
Yes.
of metadata and other forms of foreign intelligence data in the drone program.
Yes, and so everyone should go and read that. I mean, it's an incredible article, but at the same time, back to what we're talking about here, I feel like I expected more from the launch, and I think you only get one chance to get that right. And it's something where, like, Al Jazeera America, for all of its flaws in its launch, and God, were there many, the thing that it really got right was diversity. And in this case, the content is great, but the question of who's building the platform, it comes into question for me. Are they going to fix this? And, are they going to get flack for it? And I hope that it doesn't overshadow the incredible work that they're doing, but, that's something that they should have thought about from the beginning.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, I know that you have to run, so I say
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've
I
got to
do want.
run.
It's all right. I want to wrap it up there, but I do want to say that I'm really excited about.
What's
It's on the
that?
Intercept. New images from the various different intelligence agencies. So
Yes.
if you are like me and are sort of really attuned to visual imagery, it maybe has driven you a little bit nuts too that every single picture of the NSA seems to be from like 1987. If you look at the cars, they're all Chrysler K cars, literally from the late 80s, early 90s in the parking lot. It's very obvious from some of the visual clues that these photos have been updated in 15 years, if not more. So I'm just really excited to say that there's new stock footage out there. So yeah, visual editors, rev your engines.
Yes, I am also excited about that. That sounds fantastic.
Woo, it's the little things. Well, Jillian, have a wonderful evening. And I guess to everyone out there, we are so excited and grateful for you to be with us through the last 35 minutes or so, and do hope that you'll go check out the daywefightback.org today and see what's going on, and certainly pay attention to what you'll be hearing in the media and in the days to come.
Absolutely.
All
Thank you,
right.
Catherine.
Thanks, Jillian.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.